I can say that the average person goes through a work-quake every 2.85 years. You said the most important thing about work-quakes is that they are jolts where we either choose to or are forced to rethink and reimagine and reevaluate what we do, okay? But women go through them more than men, Xers go through them more than boomers, millennials go through them more than Xers, and I'm presuming that when Zers come along that they'll go through them even more frequently, so that their pace is quickening.
You're kind of defining careers synonymous with a linear kind of path. You're saying the career is dead and there's no path. Is that oversimplification?
No, that's the three lies about work. Number one is you have a career, right? So you don't have a career. That's an idea. That's an artificial construct that we assign to a series of work responsibilities that we have. And some people have them, but most people do not.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Larry Weeks. My guest on this episode talks about career-changing events he calls work-quakes. I've had so many work-quakes in my life. There's no line, jagged or otherwise, from what I studied in college to where I am today. And that's probably true now for many or most younger adults than it has been historically, at least according to my guest. I could never classify and never have classified my work life as a career. But if I did, I've had at least 7 completely different occupations, maybe 8, in completely different fields. None, save one maybe, related to the other. And through all those changes, and a lot of it was me trying to find myself, but I really wish I had had the book that my guest has written. Bruce Feiler is one of America's most thoughtful voices on contemporary life. He is the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including Life is in the Transitions, The Secret of Happy Families, Council of Dads. He has 3 TED Talks that have been viewed more than 4 million times. He teaches a TED course called How to Master Life Transitions. His latest book, which is the touchstone of this particular podcast, is called The Search: Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. It's a roadmap for finding meaning and purpose at work based on insights drawn from hundreds of life stories of all vocations and backgrounds. So in this episode, we're diving into the shifting dynamics of careers, work, and the quest for fulfillment. Bruce discusses how work is undergoing transformations due to technology, social movements, pivotal global events. He's gathered a lot of case studies and stories and parsed out kind of the patterns in people's work trajectories and emphasizes an expanded definition of work that encompasses roles that would include caregiving and others. Fascinating book, very interesting. Like I said, I wish I'd had it in my youth. And Bruce challenges conventional career notions and explains the regularity of career-changing events, which, as I said, he calls work-quakes. So if you're in transition, if you're reflecting on your own career, and many of you are, if you're seeking insights or you're just curious about general work trends, then this episode is for you. So without further ado, here's Bruce. Bruce, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
For the audience, we rehearsed that. That was our third take of welcome to the show.
But it wasn't really that good. I feel like we could do better. But
I know we can do.
We'll try to improve it as we move on.
Really appreciate you coming on. I just have a few questions about your background. It's very interesting. And some of them have to do with some books. One of is Walking the Bible, because I don't know if you know A.J. Jacobs.
I do know AJ quite well.
So I had on AJ, and he did the Year of Living Biblically. So he's
I blurbed that book actually.
Oh, really? So he his whole life is an experiment, but he's this participatory journalist. Is that kind of your background, journalism? Are you the Plimpton type?
Yeah, in fact, I started that. This is going to let me tell a fun story that I don't often tell in public.
Oh yeah.
But exactly, yeah. So since we flubbed the opening, we'll nail that. We'll nail the opening section. But let me work my way there. So because we were also talking off the air, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations of Jews in the South. I love the South. I love the familyness, and I love the stickiness, and I love the storytellingness. But I grew up Jewish in the South, which meant that I was a part of the South, but felt apart from it. I also love being Jewish. I love the familyness and the stickiness and the storytellingness. But I grew up not just apart from the sort of long Middle Eastern or, European tradition of Judaism, but even different from the American story of Judaism, because I was a Jew in the South, right? So I felt a part of it, but apart from it. And I think, one way to sort of, that I think of my life from time to time, and I think explains a lot of my work, is that is in fact where I stumbled into a life where I would go and join a culture or a subculture and become a part of it and then leave and write about it. It is that sort of becoming a part of something, but being apart from it, right? So I grew up in Savannah. I left. I went to Yale, right? So suddenly I was a Southerner in the Northeast. And I felt that I learned a lot about myself as a Southerner by leaving the South. I later sort of moved away from it later in my life. But so in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan. I wrote a book about England based on a year I spent getting a graduate degree at Cambridge. I spent a year as a circus clown. And this was a series of books. And so somewhere in this, in fact, I know exactly where it was. I was in Nashville traveling around with Garth Brooks and writing a book about him and kind of the boom of pop country music. And I realized, you know what? I'm a writer now. I can't deny it. I haven't really read the Bible since I was a kid, which meant I hadn't really read it. And so I took my bar mitzvah Bible and I put it by my bed and it sat there untouched for 2 years, gathering dust, until I went to visit an old friend who had moved to Jerusalem. And on my first day, I went to this promenade where a lot of people go on their first trip. And my friend said, there's this controversial neighborhood and there's the rock where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And I was like, whoa, you mean these are real places that you can touch and visit and feel in this sort of crazy way I live my life? I thought, well, here's an idea. What if I travel along the route and read the Bible along the way? And that's what gave birth to Walking the Bible. And what I often don't say publicly is I thought at the time, like, I'll just join the Bible as if it were the circus, right? And seek to become a part of it. And so that book sort of embodied, and you're nice to bring it up, and sort of, yes, captured this thing about me, which was this participatory thing. And that what everybody wrote in response to that was, he's the George Plimpton of his generation. And that was sort of tagged very early onto my, onto my life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very similar he sounds like he's similar to you. I should say that. But,
well, he was famous at the time. In fact, I bought a copy of Paper Lion. Actually, I didn't buy it. It was on my shelf. It belonged to my grandfather or something. Paper Lion, right, which was his book in which he played football for the Detroit Lions. And he was a place kicker, so it wasn't he wasn't like a.
And they made a movie of it, I think, or something.
Is that right? So, I remember where I was at my home in Savannah. I was about to join the circus. I had bought this Winnebago. I was like off, and my grandmother had made these matzo balls, and my father had bought that's a true story. And my father had bought, his gift was like WD-40, like this will solve every problem you have in the circus. And I pull out Paper Lion. I'm going to read it. And I'm going to find out, how does he explain the story of how he came to join the Detroit Lions? And the book, I kid you not, opens in Hyannisport, where he's at a scene where the Kennedys are playing touch football, like that iconic Camelot scene of the Kennedys playing touch football. And he's like, so I was there playing touch football with the Kennedys when in walks the owner of the Detroit Lions.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, this is extremely unhelpful to me. And I literally shut the book and I never read another word. Okay, so now the story that I told you that I never tell publicly. Okay, so this gets tagged with me like I'm the George Plimpton of my generation. And when I first moved to New York in the late 90s, I was invited to one of these literary events, like black tie, at Lincoln Center. And I go there, and I'm like, the youngest, greenest, least notarized person, or well, that's not the right word, but you get the point, at this event. And George Plimpton is there. So I'm like, am I going to do it? Am I not going to do it? I'm like, okay, yeah, Bruce, you're the kind of person who does it. So I go up to George Plimpton and I introduce myself like, hi, I'm Bruce Feiler. I've been called the George Plimpton of my generation, or some, and it bounces off his forehead, this thing, and plops in his drink. And he turns and he walks away.
Oh my
gosh. And it was very clear. He had no intention of pass. I don't know what I was looking for, some moment where he was going to pass.
What do you do with that? Yeah, if you're George, what do you?
And he was he wanted no part of it. And he literally walked away and didn't say a single thing. And then AJ, God bless him, ran with it actually, and he's still doing it. My work actually sort of took a turn later, but AJ, God bless him, is a wonderful human, a great writer, and a wonderful and a dear friend, and I'm happy for him in so many ways.
And then one more question about these previous books: are clowns happy or sad? Is it hard work? Is it fun, or is it a pain to be a clown? I'm very curious about
In order,
clowns.
clowns are neither happy nor sad. Clowns are mirrors, and they mirror what's inside of you. So if you're happy, then they're happy. And if you're sad, they're sad. I think that's the way to think about clowns. I mean, technically, there are two different kinds of clowns. There are Auguste clowns, which are the ones with the exaggerated features. And then there's a white-faced clown, which is the sort of traditional mime look with black and white. And I had been a teenage mime and juggler. And so I was a white-faced clown. But the things that clowns do is that they mimic the world around them, and they allow you to see in them what is inside of you. Okay. Which is why some people love clowns and some people hate clowns, right? Because that makes them uncomfortable. And like the worst thing you can do if you have a child and you take them to the circus is do what most parents do, which is thrust them into the arms of the clown, because that's what will scare clowns, right? So Stephen King can see in clowns horror because that's what Stephen King, uniquely sees in the world. And Pennyface and It, that's what that is. But a lot of people see in them things that they want to do, but they can't, right? So a lot of the humor of clowns is bopping people on the head and not getting hurt, right? Throwing a baby from a burning building and the baby is saved, right? So clowns have exaggerated features and exaggerated actions and do things that we want to do, but we can't. And that's one of the reasons that children love them and adults don't, is that children see them, as their fantasy of the world, and adults who are shut down and want rules and want order, want to control their kids, are threatened by them. And so that's the way to think about clowns, that they will tell you what you're going through at any moment.
That's an amazing answer to a clown question. That is great. Wow.
I don't think I've been asked a clown question in years. So I'm glad it came out that way. I had no idea what I was going to say when you asked me.
It was borderline, if not all the way in, philosophical, that answer. They are what you are in a sense. They just reflect back. That's cool. So I want to get into the new book, The Search. And it's a great book, Bruce, but it reminded me of, I was going to
say, let's talk about the book.
It reminded me of Megatrends. I don't know if you remember that book by John Naisbitt. It reminded me of that book, but only like Megatrends for work, because there's a lot of data here in trend data, I think. And you use a lot of information and you look for patterns in our work lives and our transitioning in what's happening in work, in the workforce. Just curious because of my background in data and what have you. What type of research did you do? And how much data did you collect for the book?
So you got me telling stories I don't often tell, which is a tribute to how you conduct your interviews. And it's fun for me. Let's just say I was a junior in high school. Maybe I was even going into my senior year. And in Savannah, I actually have this quite strong vision of sitting around my family's dining room table on Tybee Island, Georgia, off the coast of Savannah, where I sort of grew up. And I wrote my paper, I almost probably shouldn't admit this publicly, on megatrends. And for whatever reason, I read megatrends that summer, and I was like, this is how I don't know, am interested in, am drawn to. I don't think I looked at the world at that time, but that book in its own way really spoke to me. And I was telling the story recently because I'm a recent empty nester, and my wife and I just dropped our twin daughters off at college a few weeks ago. Like, I briefly went through a period where I was considering being a sociology major. And I bring that up because I was saying sort of out loud, it turns out all these decades later that is kind of how my mind works. And megatrends just happened to be the first thing that taught me that this is how I like to look at the world 40 years ago. So do I not tell that story often? I'm not sure I've ever told that story. Anyway, so megatrends. So let me go back to the narrative story and work my way to where we are. So
Sure.
I think of this story that we were talking about earlier now as a kind of linear life. Like I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money for a while. Then I had some success walking the Bible, as you may know, spent a year and a half on the bestseller list, and I made a TV series about it, and it produced a whole series of books about going back and forth to the Middle East, looking at contemporary religion and can we get along? And after 9/11 sort of thrust me in the middle of the interfaith movement, et cetera. And then in my 40s, my life blew up. First, I got cancer. As I'm sure you know, as a young adult, wrote this memoir called Council of Dads that became the primetime series filmed in Savannah that I was alluding to earlier. I had some financial troubles after the last recession. Then my father got very depressed from Parkinson's and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. And that is what jolted my life out of this participatory, Plimpton-esque immersion journalism into a different kind of immersion. And I'm a storyteller, and I've devoted my life both to ancient stories and contemporary stories and think a lot about how to tell stories. And I couldn't tell my life story anymore. And when found a way to tell the story, I found out that everybody had moments, or I was reminded that everybody has moments when they can't tell their life story. And so I called my wife. I was at a college reunion, and I called my wife and I was like, no one knows how to tell their story anymore. And I got to figure out how to help. And that's what sent me down what's now been a 6+ year project of collecting and analyzing life stories of Americans of all ages, all walks of life, all income backgrounds, all 50 states. And that led to my last book, Life is in the Transitions, which was a sort of a chronicle of how we get through and navigate these difficult times. It's about life quakes, as I call them, which are these disruptive moments when our lives are thrown off course. And I worked on that book, and I said to anybody who would listen to me, like, why hasn't there been back to Megatrends? Megatrends was an early 1980s book, right? That was a time when people wrote books like this, actually. There was a book by a English professor named William Bridges called Transitions. And there had not been a major book on transitions in 50 years. And I was like, what is going on? Like, why is no one talking about this? And people nodded politely and, yawned and moved on. And that was in 2019 when I finished that book. And then came the pandemic, and Life is in the Transitions came out when the entire planet was in a life transition at the right time. So suddenly I had the right book at the right time. And that became a thing, that book. And there was a TED Talk. And now I teach a TED course on navigating transitions. And in the middle of this, I realized that work was going to be sort of the next domino to fall, that this back-to-back of the technological revolution and the social justice movement and the pandemic and work from anywhere is that it just became very clear to me that the rules of work were going to be reinvented in a very narrow span. And so I went out, to answer your question, and collected hundreds more of these life stories, in this case, focusing on people's work stories. And then I got, and so I would do these interviews. They had hundreds of questions, and a lot of the process is asking over and over, person after person, sort of the same sets of questions or same set of questions. And then I would hire these teams of people, and then we would analyze them and look for patterns. And that's the essence of the work. So it's sort of like there, if it ends up Megatrends, I would be a blessing that would make me feel good. But it's also like another book that was popular at that time called Working, which is the Studs Terkel book. But that just doesn't have the analytics. Like, that's just all the stories without the analytics. But we live in an analytic time, right? So I would sometimes say this work is like Studs Terkel meets TED, right? So it's bringing contemporary ways of thinking and writing and processing ideas to what is an old-fashioned, very analog way of doing things, which is sit down with people and say, tell me about your life, and listen very, very closely.
That is so interesting, because I thought the same thing, Bruce. So your book made me think about megatrends. Hats off, because it is in that vein. But I also wondered, what the hell happened to megatrends? Things are changing so fast and so radically that people are trying to get their balance back and bearings to figure out how do I navigate? What's happening and where's it going? So in your interviews, just from a high level, and then I want to drill down. I want to kind of start Bruce high up here for the overall gist of the book and and then drill down. But was it in your interviews and the feedback that you got, and you're asking the same or the similar questions to different people and collecting and analyzing the data? I'm overgeneralizing. Again, I'm keeping this at 30,000 feet right now, but is it that people are searching for meaning generally in their lives, but they're doing it in work? They're looking for meaning in work. Is that kind of the gist that you got from your interviews?
Yeah, I think if you're looking for a headline or like a frame for this conversation,
yes,
I think a simple headline would be fewer people are searching merely for work and more people are searching for work with meaning.
Were they aware of that? Or did you ascertain that's what they were looking for?
Here's where I think the conversation gets interesting. The answer to that question up front is we have millennials to thank for this. We have the most maligned population among us to thank for this change. And I believe that this change is, let's go from 30,000 feet to 100,000 feet, is the fourth biggest change in the history of work. Okay. So now let's unpack this a little bit. The most influential story of work ever written is the Garden of Eden. And the reason it's the most influential story about work ever written is that it maligns work, right? When Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, what is the quote unquote punishment? The answer is labor. They are told now that they're going to have to work hard. And if you go culture by culture, from the ancient Greeks, well, their definition of work is misery, to the Latin word, which means torture, right? To over and over again, we have been told throughout human history that work is supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to make you miserable. It's supposed to be unhappy. Okay. So the first biggest change in the history of work is when we went from being from wandering, from being hunting and gathering, from being pastoralists, right, to being settled people. Okay. And let's call that work 0.0 to 1.0. And at that, and that stayed for, we can call it 10,000 years. And it took 90% of the people, 90% of their time just to survive, right? Just to grow the food, make the candles, build the homes, build the shelter, right? Educate the young and take care of the old. Like, it was basically the agricultural economy was economy built on misery and not on meaning, right? That's just how it was. And so then the second biggest change occurred with the Industrial Revolution. So what happened with the Industrial Revolution? Okay, so suddenly, first of all, a bunch of things get invented that make farming easier so that you have mechanized plows and other equipment so that you don't have to take 90% of your time. And this frees up a lot of people. And what do? They leave rural areas, and they go to the cities because there's a bunch of new jobs waiting in the cities for them as the whole industrial world takes note. I mean, I was on TV recently and I was asked, someone said, 3,500 people lost their jobs to AI, in the last month. And isn't this going to be a catastrophe? I was like, how many people lost their jobs 200 years ago in the Industrial Revolution? Answer: a third of the country loses its job and relocates from rural areas to city areas. Okay. And that's the second biggest change, right? So suddenly now people are going to factories and they are separated from the ground and from the agricultural cycle, and they enter an entirely different cycle. Okay. And then the third biggest change occurs after it took 10,000 years for that change. The third occurs, less than a century later, when we move essentially from the factory floor to the office floor. Okay. And so we move from the industrial economy to the office economy, from people who shower after work to people who shower before work, is how I like to think about it. And that's what they're sometimes called office workers, or sometimes we're called knowledge workers, right? So it's less brawn and more brain. Let's say that. And that's where we were for most of our lifetime. And by the way, and so in each of these transitions and how we work, there's been a change in how we talk about and how we think about work, right? So the change from the agricultural to in the agricultural, all the stories where work is supposed to be miserable. Okay. Then there's a change. And when we go from the agricultural to the industrial economy, what gets invented? An idea that was unneeded in human history before, which is the idea of the career. Okay. So the career is invented by a guy named Frank Parsons in Boston in 1908. And for the first time, you had all these workers who had needed work and all these workplaces that needed workers. And so he invents this idea of career counseling, where you get people together, you ask them a series of questions, and you say, you go and take this job, but only if you're a man, only once in your life in your early 20s. And then it was done. And he totally invents this idea. And within 2 years, it's taught in every school in the country. And he meets the need, but he totally stigmatizes the idea that you'd want to do something different in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. It was like a one and you're done kind of model for how to think about work. Well, as we move then from the industrial to the knowledge base, something else gets normalized, which is the idea of changing jobs over time. Okay. And so what gets invented, the new way to talk about work that gets invented in the white collar age is the resume. Again, an entirely new idea that no one had needed before, because you never needed an accounting of the work that you did. And so the resume gets invented and popularized in the search. I tell the whole story because it's a wonderful story that we don't talk enough about. Basically, in about a 10-year period after the war in the 1950s, the resume becomes the standard way to think about work. But even that is a very linear model, right? So the resume is a progressive series of jobs. Each one is supposed to be bigger and more prestigious and more valuable. And that's what it is. And so that's the core tension. That's the sort of, I don't know, that's the playing field that you and I grew up in. Okay. And in the context of the conversation that we're having and of my work now over the last 6 or 7 years, that is a linear model. But what's changed now is we no longer have linear lives. We have nonlinear lives. Okay. And that's the essence of the change. And for people that are 50 plus, that still makes them uncomfortable.
And this is where you have in the book, you talk about the career being dead, as it were. You're kind of defining careers synonymous with a linear kind of path. You're saying the career is dead and there's no path. Is that oversimplification?
No, that's the 3 lies about work. Number 1 is you have a career, right? So you don't have a career. That's an idea. That's an artificial construct that we assign to a series of work responsibilities that we have. And some people have them, but most people do not.
I just want to delineate here. There are like doctor, lawyer. Those are still career paths. Yes or no?
I don't think you have a career, and I don't think you have a path.
Okay.
Sure. There's some people who say, I want to play center field for the Yankees, and they play center field for the Yankees. Yes. Right. Are there some people who say, I want to be a doctor, and that takes 10 years of education, if not more. And so that's 4 years of undergrad. And I have a niece doing this right now, 4 years of undergraduate, and then whatever, 3, 4, 5 years of graduate school, and then residency and post-residency. And at this point, you've spent all this time and you've gone into debt. You're going to do this. Yes. But that doesn't change the fact that even, let's just say, medicine has been reinvented multiple times, from family practice, right, to HMOs, to insurance, and now here comes AI. So the idea, even that a doctor is going to be doing what they expect to be doing. I have a lot of doctors in my family and people that I know, as we all do, and you want to ruin a dinner party? Bring up mechanized medical records and then, listen to the groaning and moaning and whining of the doctors around you. So even that, even though they're taking the same specialty perhaps and doing it, but then even a lot of those people, they'll go into public policy on the side, or they'll go into concierge medicine. There's a lot of change in all of these things. And what the problem with the linear life is that you get trapped in a set of external expectations of meeting other people's expectations of what you should be doing, or even your own expectations when you were younger.
Bruce, I remember.
If I could capitalize this in one word, I'm interrupting you, but it would be that people of our age, we are haunted by the ghost of linearity, because we have linear expectations but nonlinear lives. And it is that gap, I think, that is responsible for far more of the unhappiness we have today than people think about.
Wow, that was profound. Because, Bruce, you and I grew up it was a stigma. If you had a job that lasted only a year, that was a problem.
Bingo.
You would not get hired. You would not get hired.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hiring people, wondering, looking at time discrepancies that influenced me as to who I was hired. Like, oh, is this person flaky? What have you? But I was the flakiest person in the world growing up. Not because I wasn't flaky. I was just lost. I would go here. I was trying to find myself through work. And it bothered me every time, because I'd look at my resume and it would be odd. And I'd always get the questions, what happened?
Yeah.
What are you doing? And you don't want to say, I'm lost and,
You're not lost. You're finding yourself. It's a totally different thing. It's not lost. You're searching. That's what this book is called.
Now, to your point, it's embraced. We don't flinch about this type of thing, right? Because workers are a little more empowered, or we're just it's just different.
This is the vulnerability that we all need to confront. The resume was powerful. It helped people. It normalized the idea of changing jobs, but it also stigmatized the idea of taking time off to spend with your family, or going to start a company that may fail, or going into public service, or taking, or running for dog catcher in your neighborhood. Like, these are valuable uses of time, and we stigmatize them. And I think, it's only a mild exaggeration to say that something like the resume squandered more human potential than almost anything that I can think of, short of war. I mean, it was war on human individuality, creativity, and meaning making. And, by the way, and you and I are two men of a certain age. If we had a woman in this conversation of a certain age, think about that. You get off the escalator. If you get off the path, spend time with your children, you're never getting back on the path, they were told. What a ridiculous, preposterous, socially violent thing to do to generations of women who just wanted to do the most natural thing of all, which is spend some time focusing on being a parent, even if they wanted to work while doing that. But if they didn't want to make the sacrifices for the large company, the linear life is cruel in many aspects to a lot of people. If you want to choose it, that's fine. But the fact that you were required to follow it is unimaginably horrid to human happiness.
It's interesting that when I was younger, it bothered me that, all my friends had career, they were 10 years into whatever career. I'm 30 and I'm still trying to figure myself out. And I was like, man, I've got no history. People, I coveted that kind of track and felt really defective for not having it. But yet, I remember my wife, she worked for SeaWorld for 20 odd years. And I remember thinking, and this is, much later, we're talking 2010 or so. I was thinking 20 years at a company, I couldn't imagine it. It felt like prison or something, but it's just funny how you kind of flip that way. So I'm looking at some of the stats, some of this data you have here. So I knew in the pandemic, right, people were switching jobs and workers were at a premium and certain roles were at a premium. So it was hard to fill roles. So the workers really had the upper hand. But quitting is still really, really high. People are still quitting. I'm looking at statistics that 3.5 million people quit jobs monthly or some number like that. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. So that brings us, this is the backstory, right? So as I said, people, whatever, 40 plus, 50 plus, we have linear expectations and nonlinear lives. And we are still haunted by the ghosts of that stigma that we all grew up in. But that's changing. And so this now allows us to talk about, why I'm saying we should be crediting millennials of all people with saving work. Okay. And so what's happened? A couple of things have happened. First of all, quitting has become destigmatized. In the last year, 50 million Americans have quit a job. Okay. In a workforce of 160 million people. Okay. That is a third of the workforce. And that number has ticked down slightly since the pandemic, but it's still twice what it was 10 years ago. Okay. And so that's a massive number right there. The Great Resignation narrative of the pandemic is misleading because it suggests that the pandemic created it. In fact, it had been growing essentially every year for this century, except for one. Okay. And so the quitting is now been destigmatized. That's point number one. Another third of the workforce is saying, I'm not sure I want to be doing what I'm doing. Like, I don't want to go into the workplace 5 days a week anymore. Or I don't want, if they're in a white collar job that doesn't require it. Or like, I don't want to go in 5 days a week. Or I don't want to have a long commute. Or I want to use that time to work out or be a parent. Okay. One of the things that has fed this change is a generational change in how we family and how we parent. the work can be miserable and you have to do what the company says was basically built in a time in which men were almost exclusively working in the white collar workforce and women were almost exclusively staying home. Well, now 3/4 of women work outside the home, and maybe it's not 3/4, but maybe 2/3 of men are very involved in parenting now, right? So there is this other social change that people are not prepared to sacrifice. If the company says jump, people are going to say how high? Not anymore. Okay, the company says move. You can say, I don't want to move. My spouse has a life, or my children are on the travel soccer team, or whatever it might be. So another big change is the role of kind of gender dynamics and family. And then what the pandemic introduces is this work from anywhere, right? So I believe very strongly with every fiber of whatever my body or the brain power I've been trying to think about this with in recent years, that what we have is exactly what you just said there, which is a rebalancing of power between the worker and the employer. Okay. And we see a lot of articles that say, okay, pandemic's over, economy is softening, and therefore the employers are going to regain power, right? And what are the examples? They say, everyone's saying, come back to the office, right? So Facebook says you have to come back to the office, but only 3 days a week. Okay. Google says, like, we're going to start having it in your Google, right? You know, Google. Yeah. It's going to be in your, whatever, your performance review if you don't show back, but only 3 days a week. Fridays in the office are dead. They're not coming back. Like, we are shifting, and every change in the history of work, whether it be from 7 days to 6 days, to the weekend, to the vacation, to retire, all these things were invented from the bottom up. Okay, fascinating moment in labor right now. You and I are having this conversation right as one of the strikes in Hollywood has been resolved almost entirely to the benefit of the writers. That almost never happens in a strike, but that's exactly what just happened, because we are in this dynamic where workers are saying, I'm fed up and I'm not putting up with it anymore. And so now, just one data point, you've been talking about the data kindly, one question I ask people. I'm going to ask you, Larry, what's the number one upside about work you learned from your parents?
Upside of work that I learned from my parents?
But the number one value or upside of work you learned from your parents?
Outside of money and dignity, I'm really not sure.
Talk to me about, what does dignity mean?
I don't want to use the word bum, but you're lazy, or you're not earning your keep, something along those lines.
So work is a value of an expression of your character, basically.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You have to be responsible. You have to earn money. You have to be dignity. You have to work hard.
And if not explicit, implicit. Yeah.
Yes. Got it. So what was the number one downside about work? Thing that you didn't want to do that you learned openly or implicitly, explicitly or implicitly from your parents?
I didn't want to be miserable about it. Yeah. And I didn't want to do it 7 days a week. What's funny is, as soon as I'm saying this, I have worked 7 days a week, and I've been unhappy about, I've been kind of a workaholic in my life. So,
but you've also not been willing to sacrifice your dignity. You're not, that's exactly what you said earlier. You were not prepared to accept the existing narrative. Okay. So now I'm turning here to page, this is the search if you're watching on YouTube, and I'm turning to page 164. So just as a matter of storytelling. So when I started these questions, the first question I asked everybody was, what's the number one upside about work you learned from your parents? And basically everybody gave a sort of version of what you said, but often more expressly like the value of hard work, like that was the giver of the dignity. And as a storyteller and as a questioner, I was like, if everyone's saying the same thing, this isn't interesting, right? So then I'm like, well, why don't I start asking people the downside? Okay. So I have here, when we crunched the numbers, 2/3 of people said that the number one upside about work they learned from their parents was the value of hard work, followed distantly by love what you do and by, be true to yourself. Okay. But basically 2/3 of the people say they learned the value of hard work. But when I asked the downsides, it got very interesting, because the answers were all clumped around 1/3. The number one answer, overwork. The number two answer, strain on the family. The number three answer, unhappiness. There is the story in a nutshell. People are prepared to work hard. That is still a value that we value. This idea that, young people don't want to work hard, that's bunk. People still want to work hard, but they're not prepared to overwork. They're not prepared to put a strain on the family, and they're not prepared to be unhappy. That's the only megatrend you need to know. There's no longer a stigma about quitting. And when there's no longer a career, because half the people, here's a stat for you, half the people who change jobs change vocations. So when there's no longer a stigma against quitting, there's no longer a stigma against doing something else, when you are no longer bound by the resume and that every job has to be linearly progressive from the last one, if your work starts making you work too hard or put a strain on your family or be unhappy, you'll quit. And it was millennials who found this first. And now the benefits of that are ricocheting up to the Xers and to the boomers.
So let me parse this, because there's a voice in my head that's speaking up about the value of effort, and help me split out or define work or effort in a way that makes sense, because there is value in work, and there is a self-esteem building aspect of work and accomplishment. And I don't mean just any kind of work, but I have to use it in a general sense. And I want to talk about happiness in this sense, and tell me how all this fits in. Satisfaction versus pleasure, and pleasure versus happiness. Satisfaction, in my opinion, is achieved through effort and struggle. And pleasure, I think Arthur Brooks said, you could spend all day, looking at porn or playing video games, and that's pleasurable, but it's not satisfying. You're not working toward a goal or accomplishing something. So I want to lift up the idea of hard work or effort, but I want to see how it fits into what you're saying about the model of work. So I guess if I were to put it together in my head, the idea would be there's satisfaction in doing hard things in areas of one's interest so that it contributes to work satisfaction and maybe happiness.
Here's how I put it in language that I have tried to understand this through. And it has to do with time. Okay. The most important element to this conversation, at least this part of this conversation, but the conversation about personal satisfaction, is time. So happiness is present oriented. Okay. It's how you feel right now. Okay. It's a feeling. It's an emotion. It is what animals can be happy. Humans can be happy, but animals can't have meaning and humans can. And the difference between happiness and meaning is that meaning stitches together past, present, and future. It takes a broader view of time. So meaning is how we survive, endure, and find identity and purpose through times of unhappiness, because part of life, by its very definition, involves unhappiness. Okay, there's going to be a pandemic. There's going to be a downsizing. There's going to be a diagnosis. Exactly. And if happiness is your single-minded goal, well, what are you going to do with your unhappy? You're going to torture yourself, and you're going to say that my life isn't good. But that's not, in fact, how it is to be alive. Being alive is in part making me, finding identity and purpose and self-confidence and mourning. That's, the core of what life is in the transitions about, right? Is this process of the 3 stages of a life transition, as I call them, the long goodbye, where you say that old life is not here, and the messy middle, where you're exploring and building a new life and shedding habits from the old life, and then the new beginning. And that's how do you stitch them together? The answer is how you stitch together past, present, and future is through a story. That's why story is the essence of this to me, because it is the meaning making, the fundamental human act. It is the meaning making forge that we have in our identities to process the world through story. Okay. And the story is over time. So now when you take this frame of happiness versus meaning and you apply it to work, here's the missing ingredient. Okay. So as I said in my book, The Search is built around 3 lies and a truth about work. The 3 lies are you have a career. We've discussed that. You have a path. We've discussed that. You have a job. We haven't really discussed that, but let's just say no one has a job anymore. They have multiple jobs from which they cobble together a meaning. Maybe this one they do for money and this one they do for meaning, etc. But you can discover that in the book. But the one truth is that only you can decide what gives you meaning. Only you can decide what story you want to tell. And this goes back to Frank Parsons. So Frank Parsons, with his idea of the career 15 years ago, the core idea was you do it once at 21. You decide what you want to do at 21. This is why follow your passion is the worst piece of career advice, because it describes almost nobody who is happy. because only 10% of the people follow their passion. I crunched the numbers on this in my book, right? 85% of the people change their passion. It evolves over time. Something happens to you, and you look at the world. You have something experience. You have a life. You have a child, and there's whatever carcinogens or something in the shampoo, and you go invent a shampoo company. We all know this story. You don't know this at 21. You have to be open. So the question comes back to time, and that question is, what do you want to do now? What gives you meaning today? What story do you want to tell at this moment? And that's what's been missing from work, which is why the search is built around what I call a meaning audit, right? This personal archaeology where you figure out, I'm in a moment in my life when I need to make money because I have college debt, or in my case, I have 2 kids I'm sending to college, or I'm in a moment where I've been at the same company for 22 years and I want to do something for myself. Or I've been a parent or taking care of an aging relatives, and I've been burned out. So I want to start something, or I want to give back, or whatever it might be. 20 times in your life, you're going to go through a work-quake, and you're going to have to say to yourself, what is it that I want to do now? And there's never been a toolkit for asking yourself that question, which is what I've tried to introduce in this book.
So let's park there for a second, because you mentioned work-quakes a couple of times. A work-quake, and it seems self-evident in the word itself, but this is some kind of disruption or a reevaluation of work, right? And it could be involuntary, you get fired, or voluntary, you quit, or you're changing a job, or you go back to school, or the pandemic, just big work-quake, right? All of a sudden, people lost businesses, jobs, or changed jobs, stopped working in an office and worked from home, whatever. Those are examples of work-quakes. And you say in the book that an individual probably experiences work-quakes almost every 3 years, or 2.8 or something like that, right?
2.85 years, yeah.
Right, 2.85, right? So tell me, after a work-quake, and I think your book outlines this, but give us a general template. It seems like there needs to be a reevaluation or a reflective period of, okay, what do I like? What do I want? And as soon as I say these, it seems, because I don't know their bills, I don't know what's piling up from a financial standpoint. It seems like a luxury to take time to say, hey, what do I want to do? How do we know the market's going to accept whatever they want to do? This whole ball of wax, Bruce, seems a bit complicated. Can you simplify it for me, or at least?
Oh, I can say this. I can say that the average person goes through a work-quake every 2.85 years. You said the most important thing about work-quakes is that they are jolts, where we either choose to or are forced to rethink and reimagine and reevaluate what we do. Okay. But women go through them more than men. Xers go through them more than boomers. Millennials go through them more than Xers. And I'm presuming that when Zers come along, that they'll go through them even more frequently, so that their pace is quickening. And I think the actual signature piece of data in this book is 45% of them begin in the workplace. As you said, you get laid off, you're fired.
By the way, this is palliative. Just knowing this fact, people now feel they don't feel alone in this. Yeah,
I always say my work, the reaction to my work, here's a technical scientific term, is like, thank you. You validated. It's like you were putting, my wife likes to say that I have hard knowledge about soft things, right? Like I'm putting language to things that we feel that we don't often talk about. And I didn't seek this role out, but I'm happy to be playing this role. But 45% of work-quakes begin in the workplace, but that means 55% begin outside of the workplace. Right? Something happens with your health, with your family, with the country, with the planet, with the pandemic, right? With AI, which has nothing to do with you or your workplace, but suddenly AI is going to be a work-quake for a lot of people. So the work-quakes happen. And then the proper response to a work-quake is a meaning audit, right? Is a process of, who am I right now? What is it that will bring me meaning? What is it that I want to be doing now? And that answer might be, I need to replace this income very quickly. And that there is no reason to shame or stigmatize that. If we're talking about stigma, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I've got bills. I don't have a big enough cushion. I just talked to someone who's going through a work-quake. He's got 4 kids, and actually, this is and one on the way. Okay, and I mean, I actually tell this story. Actually, it appears in my book, of a man who was a great man who was the chief Latinist of the Vatican. a Catholic priest and Latin scholar. So when the Pope would give a speech in English or Italian or Spanish, he would translate it into Latin.
Wow.
And without going into it, you can find the details in the search. There was a young lass in the Vatican who became pregnant by the chief Latinist, and he's no longer a priest. And he now is a college professor, and he has 4 children and one on the way. He has a series of financial concerns to him that he did not have as a priest, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying, right now, I need to focus on money because I have obligations, because I have desires, because my family is the most important thing that brings me meaning right now. But the only problem is saying that that's the only source of meaning. When the search came out, I was in dialogue with the Wall Street Journal about running a large excerpt on the cover of the weekend section. And this is the story that I tell. And one of the things I tell is that the majority of people in a work-quake make a decision that what gives them meaning right now is not money. And they will prioritize service or giving back or, doing something for the family or whatever it is. And they're like, you can't, literally my editor said to me, you can't say this in the Wall Street Journal. There's the word Wall Street in the title. You can't say that you can define success by means other than money. Here's the data. This is what's going on. And they put it in Wall Street Journal, and it was like the most emailed piece of the month and helped launch this book into the ecosystem. Because the issue is not that money is not a source of meaning and is not a valuable and valued thing to make a decision for. It's that it's not the only decision that people make. Okay. And study out of Harvard, 2/3 of people will give up 1/3 of their lifetime earnings for work that brings them more meaning. The issue is what brings you meaning. If that's money, hooray, let's throw a party, go try to get a job that will give you money and status. But we have been telling a story in this country since the origin of this country, which is that the only way to get ahead is to climb. Bigger office, higher floor, greater salary, more benefits, okay, up by your bootstraps, rags to riches. In fact, the people who are happiest and most fulfilled in work don't just climb, they also dig. And they do this archaeology that I'm talking about to figure out, who am I right now? So even if you're choosing money today, if I could beseech you on one thing, is to recognize that you might not always make that decision. And in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or 15 years, your life might look different and you might make a different decision. So respect your future self and respect those around you. And in many cases, it might even be your children who make a decision to write a different kind of story. And that's the opportunity that we have today. Everybody can write their own story.
We're in a unique situation as far as time in 2023. So you mentioned the agricultural revolution and industrial revolution, all these big changes, revolutions in economic activity and how it applies to work. I mean, if I were to take if I were to live back then and then time travel to here, I'm in this unique situation where I'm thinking in the past, because of necessity, if it wasn't impossible, it was very difficult to put meaning or derive a lot of meaning from labor, because it was, I'm just putting food in my mouth or on the table or what have you. I'm wondering if we're putting too much on work still, but we're living in this unique time. But are we putting too much on work, Bruce? Or is it because of the times that we live in that we can and we should be?
Here's what I think. I think the great blessing and opportunity at the moment is that we are putting meaning in the heart of our lives. And work is can be a primary mechanism of that meaning making. And so I would broaden the definition of work. We didn't get into this and we're wrapping up here. But this touches on the third of the 3 lies, which is that you have a job. No, you have multiple jobs. Okay. You have a main job, but only half of people have that. You have a care job. Caring for your family is also work. If you look at modern parenting, and I wrote a book called The Secrets of Happy Families. I wrote a column about contemporary families in the New York Times for a decade. Parents use the language of work and labor. Okay, it's your job to do bath time, but I'll do bedtime, right? Or I have to do more for the family right now so that my spouse can go back and get a graduate degree. That is labor, and that is a balance of labor. It's a choice and it's meaningful, but it's also difficult and exhausting. Okay. We have side jobs. We know that. I've 2 terms I've coined in this book, right? Hope job, which is work that we do that we hope leads to something else, right? And ghost jobs, which are these invisible time sucks like imposter syndrome and discrimination, and worrying about money or sobriety that drag on us. And the point is, work is how we spend our time. It's how we move. It's physics and it's poetry at the same time, right? Work equals numbers plus words. Okay. And most of the conversation we've had is reducing it to numbers, hours, profit, margin, salary, benefits. But it's the words that matter. So what we need in the conversation about work, and what I appreciate that we've been able to do here, is we need less math and we need more literature. Okay. We need to remember the poetry of how we use work to feel fulfilled. And if that means we're putting too much value in work, I'll take that criticism, because I think how we spend our time is fundamentally an act of work. And it's just the problem is that we have to rewrite the story of work. So work is not supposed to be miserable.
We've defined the term work. It's too narrow. It's too small.
Correct.
I love it. You're making it broader and bigger, and applies to anything where I'm putting effort into for some kind of interest I have or accomplishment I'm trying to do. And got the old thinking, Bruce, work is, in my mind, it's just, it's a thing that you hate, not that's
get off the should train. Get off the should train. We think it should be this. Get on the one train.
I love it. So before we go, can you 80-20 to me, like one or two questions out of all of the questions that you encourage people to ask themselves or suggest they ask themselves when they're going through a work-quake? Is there one or two that the other dominoes fall, or can you approximate
that's exactly what the search is. It's 21 questions to find work you love. If I were to pick, one from the past, who were your role models as a child? That's the first choice we make about work, right? Because we inherit our parents, but we choose our role models. So who were your role models and what did you admire about them? That's a question about the past. One about the present, which is, I'm in a moment in my life when blank. Ask that question. I'm in a moment in my life when I want to make money. I want to give back. I want to serve. I want to write a novel.
I'm in a moment in my life now.
I'm in a moment in my life right now when blank, and then look forward. Look toward the future. I want my purpose in life to be blank, right? So very simple questions. That's what the book offers, is a series of questions. And I agree with you that we often put the how question first, like how do I go get a job? But in fact, the who, what, when, where, and especially the why are in fact more valuable, because if you start with the how too quickly, you're going to be 2.85 years from now doing it again, because you're going to be unhappy. Now, again, you might have to because you need money, but then you're making a deal with yourself that right now I got to focus on money, but in the future I might not as my circumstances change. So those are the three questions. But the larger question is, what is the story about work that I want to be telling? How do I think of my life, my work as a story, as opposed to an obligation, and as opposed to a source of misery, and as opposed to giving up my labor for somebody else? Reclaim your own agency over your work life. That's the core gesture that we're doing here.
Bruce, the book can be found anywhere, right? That books are sold.
Yep.
How do they find you? Your website?
So we've been talking here about the search, which is called Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. The prior book that we talked about is Life is in the Transitions. If you happen to be going through a life quake right now and not a work quake, mastering change at any age. I'm Bruce Feiler, which is Feiler. You can find me on all the social media channels under my name. I write a weekly newsletter on Substack in which I explore these ideas called The Nonlinear Life, which is brucefeiler.substack.com. And I love hearing from people, and share your story, and let's reclaim work, and let's make it something that we have more control over, and that we have more, that we can find the building blocks of meaning, which are agency, belonging, and cause. And we can change the story. We can take work back, and we can make it something that brings us all meaning and purpose and joy.
Did I hear you say that you teach a course, or you have a course?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to my site, I click to it. I teach a course on TED. It's a TED course called How to Master Life Transitions, which is grows out of a TED talk I gave on the secret to mastering life transitions, and is part of this larger conversation of taking this abstract thing of going through a life transition and trying to make it concrete and giving people steps and tools and takeaways that can help all of us get through them more effectively.
Man, I sure wish this book was around when I was in my late 20s, because man, oh man. But this book is a result of the times that we live in. So, I mean, you certainly can't do it. This is where we are. Bruce, thank you so much. This was
my pleasure.
This was fantastic. I loved it. You were great, man. I appreciate it.
I look forward to seeing you down the line.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit larryweeks.com, and we will talk again soon.